Okay, let's roll. Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome as our next speaker, Sebastian Wettinger, who is a PhD candidate at UCLA. Sebastian's prior degrees in economics are from University of Zurich in Switzerland. He does applied micro, but also economic history, economic geography, and a bit of political economy. And today he is presenting a very exciting paper on how history matters. It's about the effect of national leaders on state performance. Sebastian.
Okay, excellent. So thank you very much for having me. This paper is joint work with my advisor at UCLA, Nico Voigtlander. Now, the paper starts off the evidence we have on the role of leaders. Specifically, we have some evidence that leaders matter in firms and in local politics. Say, for firms, people have identified that CEOs have a bearing on the performance of their and strategy of their companies. That's basically the Bertrand Shaw paper, where what they do is they look at fixed effects and see whether these fixed effects of individual leaders, CEOs, as they switch between companies, have some explanatory power on the performance of these companies. Now, you can also use this approach to basically identify the effect of leaders in politics, but you need some switchers. So what basically Yao and Sang have been doing at the regional level is in politics to look at regional governors in China, and as they are switched across provinces, see whether basically their fixed effects can explain some of the variation in GDP over time for these provinces. Now, it's harder to get it at the national level because there you rarely have switchers. You rarely have some president that basically runs one country and then comes to power in another country. Apart from very few historical cases, you don't have those, so you can identify any fixed effects in there. Yet this entire debate of whether national leaders have a bearing on the performance of the countries they rule has basically been reverberated throughout history for more than a century. But most of the other big minds have made up their mind on this, such as Tolstoy and Marx have thought about the question of, do leaders matter, national leaders, for the countries they rule? Yet the evidence we have in terms of political science and basically broader history is mostly correlational. So only in recent years have economists brought identification to this debate. Specifically, Jones and Olkin have used the fact that if a leader exits randomly, say to a death out of some heart attack or any other condition, then you can use this to compare the growth rates around the transition, around the death, to basically identify whether this leader had a bearing on the on growth of the state. Now, what you find from this leader focusing on those leadership transitions is that indeed leaders matter. They tend to have the death of a leader tends to lead to a small reduction in growth after those random deaths. That, however, is only for modern data, and it's a bit higher if you consider the educated leaders as opposed to others. But it's very hard to get at true kind of features of the leaders beyond this. Now, beyond the problem of this being just about transitions, rather than the full reign of those leaders and looking into their abilities, it is also plagued by the problem of growth rates being highly volatile, and such. Basically, people have argued that the standard outcomes that people have used, the average growth rate during the tenure, is largely useless to assess the ability or the effect of leaders. So ideally, what you would want to have is an experiment, so to say. Your ideal experiment would be to randomly appoint leaders that vary in some important features, say their ability to different states and different points in time, and then observe for this reign while they rule the country, state level outcomes, and correlate those. And then you can basically, you'd have your perfect experiment. Now, for better, we don't run those experiments, and no country would want to join in such an experiment. So we have to revert to history, where we argue we have identified a setting that gets, if not to the setting, pretty close to such an experiment. Specifically, we're going to focus on leaders of a particular type, European monarchs, namely, that ruled over Europe, over large chunks of Europe from the period about 1000 to 1914, to the beginning of World War I. For these monarchs, we compile a data set at the reign level. So for each monarch at each reign when they rule, for those states, for a wide range of states and empires, combining proxies of ability of a ruler and the performance of the state during the reign of this ruler. And I'll go in far much detail in a few minutes. Now, the crucial thing while we're focusing on the setting, beyond just particular interest in the setting, because this is after all the period where most individuals, where most historians have written about, this is when leaders matter, use these European monarchs, Napoleon, these are the people that mattered, is because it allows us to advance in identification, to really identify the effect of leaders on state performance. Because as you might expect, there's a myriad of there's reverse causality, there's a meta-variable bias. If I were to show you that these things correlate, the ability of a ruler and the performance of the state, it must not be a causal effect. And so what we do in here is we advance an identification that is basically based on variation, on the fact that the variation in ruler ability comes from two features. Namely, for first, most of these monarchs came to power not because they were elected, maybe based on their ability, but because they were in the line of succession. Their appointment was predetermined and independent of their ability. So they came to power because they were, say, the oldest son of the prior monarch. And secondly, crucially, not only come these to power randomly, there also there's quasirandom variation in their ability due to the widespread inbreeding in European dynasties. What's crucial here is that the negative effects of inbreeding were not understood until very much into the 20th century. And crucially, this degree of inbreeding was also unknown to the leaders due to very complicated family trees and to calculations of the correct measure of inbreeding that they could not have known. So what we'll do is this, with this instrument, using the degree of inbreeding as an instrument for ruler ability, we're going to argue and we're going to show that ruler ability has a strong bearing on state performance. Specifically, and it is sizeable, namely a 1 standard deviation increase in ruler ability within the same state increases the state performance of that state by also about 1 standard deviation and increases the territory of that state by about 15%. So these are sizable effects, and leaders seem to have mattered causally for the performance of their state. Now, what is crucial here, what speaks to the institutional context is the fact that the institutional context could basically alleviate the bearing of monarchs on their states. Specifically, when rulers were constrained by parliaments or other peer groups in the state, then that is when their ability doesn't really have an effect any longer on the performance of their state. We get at this by coding reign-specific constraints of the executive for all those reigns on all these years of history. So this is being our main finding. Let me briefly mention the contributions this paper makes to the literature. Specifically in this literature on the debate on whether national leaders matter and whether it's truly them or whether they're basically born because of their time, as Tolstoy and Spencer and others would have argued, Hegel, Spengler, a lot of great debates early on with a lot of modern evidence too. We're the first to provide causal identification where we basically use quasi-random variation, the ability of rulers, rather than using, transitions of rulers coming to power. By the second result, whereby we show that constrained rulers don't really matter any longer, is we contribute to literature that argues that the institutional environment might mediate the effect of leaders in when they are in power. Lastly, because we're focusing on a trait of a leader, not just the identity, here's a leader of a certain type, but rather this leader is more or less able. So we have a trait. We can argue, we can shed light on the debate as to why leaders matter. So leaders matter, but why do they matter? We show direct evidence that they matter because of differences in their ability as leaders. Okay. If any questions, that would be because otherwise I'll outline the paper and go deeper into data and historical background.
Oh, so far so good. Thanks. Please continue.
So in this presentation, I'll talk about, I'll first introduce you to data and historical background, and then I'm going to show you the correlation between ruler ability and state performance, and then talk about our instrument, introduce it, show the first stage, and lastly, show you how constraints on the power of monarchs mitigated their effects on state performance. So The setting here is very should be well known to most of you because this is Europe's formation under hereditary monarchies. So after the Roman Empire collapsed, hundreds of small, bigger political entities emerged that after some time were ruled by dynasties, and after a bit more time, mostly by primogeniture, namely with a fixed rule of possession of the youngest born son, or oldest born son of the prior leader. These dynasties were in power for centuries in particular countries. They came to power due to those predefined rules of succession, and there was a lot of intermarriage, which is crucial for our instrument later on between those various dynasties. That's why what makes the setting, what makes our identification possible, but also what distinguishes it from other settings, because we have examples of intermarriage among ruling elites in other countries and settings. However, for those, we don't have data available. So for Europe, millions of histories have been written talking about individual leaders and kind of in the performance of states, so that allow us, and also we have the trees and the family trees, the pedigrees, to basically calculate coefficients of inbreeding, unlike for other settings. So just to give you an overview of what the data will cover, we'll cover most of Western Europe and a lot of Eastern Europe too nowadays, and most of Northern Europe and Southern Europe, with the large exception of most chunks of the Holy Roman Empire and the Italian Peninsula. So what you see here is that those empires that emerge, those states, tend to emerge over time. They tend to stabilize, but they tend to grow, and some of them then consolidate into the modern nation states that we know today and came apart in the 19th century. So what we do for this is we basically get data for monarchs that ruled most of these states, coming from over 60 dynasties, ruling about 15 states over this entire period from about 1000 to World War I. We have two challenges here, and that we need to address if you want to measure, if you want to answer whether the ruler ability is related with the performance of the state. First, we need to measure the ability of monarchs, and I'll go in more detail in a minute. Let me just tell you what we do ahead. Is we basically built on the work of an historian biologist, Frederick Adams Woods, who basically made a categorical assessment of the ability of individual monarchs, looking through a lot of historical works. We expand this, we validate this, and we add to Eastern European countries that Woods himself did not code. The second challenge then will be to measure the performance of states, again at the reign level. So you can't use something like population or urbanization data for which you have proxies, but which are usually at the century level. We need something that covers kind of very flexible those reigns as they start in particular years and end there. So here's where we again draw on Woods, and in a later work where he basically assessed, again categorically, how well a country did in political and economic matters. And we again extend this for those additional countries. To have a more a narrower but more objective measure, we basically also add proxies for the territorial gains or losses during the reign of a ruler for each of those monarchs. Let me provide a bit more data on the ability, This comes from Frederick Adams Woods, a biologist at MIT, an historian, biologist turned historian, who basically in this time period studied the heritability of genius. It was of interest for his days as part of a broader research on genetics, where he basically presumed that that certain characteristics of individuals are heritable over time, and he focused on the rulers of particular countries, because this is where he said you can basically quantify those and measure those over extended periods of time. Whereas you might not know how smart, say, your great-grandmother was, you have some proxies for this historically because there's been documentations for a lot of those historical people. Now, he does this, covering about 330 reigns in 13 states listed down there, up until 1800. Where basically what he does is he codes the ability of monarchs on a very rough scale of kind of very smart individuals, not very smart individuals, and all those in between, which we translate into basically -1, 1, and 0 for the ease of kind of for numerical analysis. Now, if you already have a concern of they kind of Woods looked at the performance of the states, and then he only assessed, well, or other historians looked at how well a country did, and because Austria fared well under Maria Theresa, they prescribe it to Maria Theresa, to the ruler. Well, such a kind of bias would be addressed by RIV. a different bias would be, well, what if you looked at ability of the ruler first and then coded state performance, which is why we have a second outcome, namely the change of the area under the reign. So let me tell you about these two performance indicators we have now. Knowing the ability of a monarch, let me tell you about the performance, about the indicators we have for state performance. Specifically, we have two proxies for that. One, again, comes from Woods directly from a later work, where he basically again collected assessments of the material conditions of a state, and where his hypothesis conveniently works against our first stage, because he argued that he presumed that more kin marriage among successful dynasties, those dynasties selected to become dynasties in the first place, should produce better ruler over time and better rule in the first place. That turned out to be wrong, and he couldn't have known it because it wasn't known that inbreeding per se is a bad thing, and that it kind of has only negative effects on people who suffer from that. Again, as before, he coded this on a categorical scale that we put into numbers, and again we verify and extend that. I'll give you a bit more details on that in a second. We now add on this, because of this concern that he might have just looked at one of those first, with another measure of performance of states. It's arguably a bit narrower, and it's not going to be the same for all countries. What we're going to look into is basically state border changes. So how does the area of, say, Austria or France change under the reign of a particular monarch? So we have this at 5-year intervals, and we basically link this to the beginning and the end of each of those reigns, and from this calculate the percentage change in the area under in the area that was ruled by a monarch under the reign of that monarch. Say, if I think I have an example here, where I come to my favorite Maria Theresa, where you see this is Austria, and under her reign, those are the areas lost, Silesia, and those are the areas gained. On net, the gain during her reign was about 7%. And we'll obviously do this for all for which it's possible in our data set. Now, we don't just trust Woods, but we validate him. So we had an RA basically go through all of the monarchs and assess their ability and the performance of their state independently using Wikipedia and other reference works in the internet to just check very intuitively, does what Woods coded up, does it make sense? So as you can see here, from our validation, our bin scatters within the same country, you see that there's a lot of agreement between modern assessments of these monarchs and what Woods assessed about 100 years earlier. After doing this, we then also extended the data set to basically add Hungary and Poland and extend our coding for all reigns after Napoleon, but until World War I. So just to kind of get this range until the end of most monarchies in Europe. Now, with this data at hand, namely proxies for the ability of a monarch and the performance of state.
Sebastian, there is
yes.
One question from Timur.
Yes. What do you call modern assessments? So basically, we had this RA go through the Wikipedia entries and Encyclopedia Britannica and other online reference works, and look at what people basically what people write about those. Whether this kind of individuals this monarch is rated as smart, as intelligent, or whether kind of he's portrayed otherwise. Similarly for the performance of a state. So again, we do this for modern ones, but we also kind of validate with the earlier data set. Did that answer your question? Otherwise, feel free to jump in.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So with this at hand, with measures on state performance and the ability of rulers as proxies for that, we can get a first look at data and see whether indeed these are correlated. As you might expect, there's a very strong positive association between ruler ability and the performance of the state during the reign of that monarch. So specifically, you see the ratings here. So these are the smart monarchs, the ones that were rated as very able by historians, by Woods and us. And you see here that it's under those where countries on average tended to do very well. And on the other hand, monarchs that are rated as incapable, unintelligent, it's for those during which the country tends to suffer in terms of its economics and political affairs. Now, we can go beyond this, just this kind of first graph look at the data, and just run regressions to include more to account for, just compare rulers of the same country or in similar time periods. So what we do is we basically correlate those measures, the performance of the state and vulnerability. And what we show here is that there's all these coefficients in all throughout the presentations will be standardized coefficients. So here you can see, for instance, that a 1 standard deviation increase in vulnerability increases the performance of the state by about 0.5 standard deviation in the same range. Now, as you can see from the second column, you can basically include state fixed effects, just compare monarchs in the same state, and also compare monarchs in the same state and the same century. And what you see that this is a very robust correlation between association between the ability of a monarch, the assessed ability, and the assessed performance of the state. Now, as I pointed to, there might be some variants that you think, well, because what if he just coded the state performance because he already knew earlier that those monarchs were smart. So we can, again, apart from using our own assessments, which could all start from this, we can just use a more narrow measure, name it area. And that's what we show in columns 4 to 6. Where basically, again, you see that there's a sizable effect of a sizable association within the same country and even century between the ability of a monarch and the change in the area of the country that they've reigned. Now, in the paper, we do a lot of things to kind of convince ourselves that this is not just a fluke in the data. Particularly, we look at we exclude some cases where, say, a monarch ruled in 2 countries at the same time, as for Charles V. We exclude regencies, periods of foreign rule. Regencies are when someone else is basically ruling instead of the monarch. We use our own coding of rulability and performance only. We only use Woods, which is what the entire NBR draft is based on. It's only using that of Woods. We recode those assessments to work against us. We use dummies rather than our categorical variables that we somewhat treat badly in our linear regression model. So we just include dummies for those. So we use other probit models. We do a lot of clustering of the standard areas at different level, include, say, for instance, dynasty fixed effects. So it's not all driven by some bad monarchs, hailing from some particular unable dynasty or those, or the opposite. We also look at, and the baseline results are very comparable for all of those robustness checks. So also interesting is that we can look in particular features that we measure. The effect is not stronger for monarchs that ascended to the throne young or that ruled longer, or for the few female monarchs we have. Crucially, it's not just a feature of, say, the early days of European monarchies, but rather it is it's consistent all over time period. You see a strong effect of monarchs on ability, except for the last time period where basically the effect becomes weaker over time. But then also in the last, it basically becomes very, very weak, still positive, but no longer statistically significant, which we're going to provide an intuition for, this having to do with the ever stronger constraints on the ability of the monarchs to actually influence things, because they were checked by parliaments in their states. Now, let's look at a bit more the heterogeneity of this specifically. For now, I just showed it you for all countries together. What I do here is we basically look into the effect for individual countries only. And what you see here is that effects are very strong for some countries, Prussia, Hungary, Castile, Portugal, Poland, and weaker for others. But mostly, except for the Netherlands, effects are strong and sizable all throughout. And we're again going to relate this to the fact that why is it certain countries kind of have weaker and stronger effects. So in some cases, we can link it to institutional history. Specifically here, you see England, where England before the 1600 basically very much looks like a standard European country. In terms of the rulers, the ability of ruler has a strong bearing on the performance of the state. However, after 1600, which we just take as a cutoff date for this time period of the Long Parliament and then the Glorious Revolution, where Parliament became more powerful in one of these, it being one of the early monarchies of Europe. So what happened in there is that basically after 1600, you no longer see a strong effect of the ability of a monarch on the bearing of their country, and we'll jump into it later.
Sebastian, there is a question in the chat from Constantine.
Okay.
He asked, which control variables do you use?
Absolutely, seen it. So in this, it's basically just the state fixed effects. So here we just look at state fixed effects and basically show you the coefficients for these basically interactions of the baseline with state fixed effects is what I'm showing you here. So there's no, and it's to bring it to this point, it's very complicated to think about what are actual control variables in the sense, because recall this is kind of at this, it's in the same state. So we just have these state fixed effects, but then you need something that actually varies at the reign level. So we're going to show you later that we control for conflict to the extent that we can do it, and for others those things, and earlier I talked about some heterogeneity, but those things can be outcomes too, so kind of can be related to.
Sorry, there's another question from him asking about the parliamentary versus absolute monarchy.
No, we don't. So you mean kind of, but that's exactly what we're going to link to later on. But later we're going to measure the constraints on the executive's institutional feature, and then basically use an heterogeneity analysis. So, but it's a good point. We could take measures of the problem is you need this historically for a long time period. So polity 4, which tends to have those data, only starts in 1800. And so what we've done for the one particular variable that we were interested in, we basically coded up ourselves for the earlier time period, the individual years where constraints on executive changed on executive. Now,
Sebastian, if I may, there are a couple of outliers on this picture. One is Russia, where there are no checks and balances, quite obviously, but the effect is insignificant. Another one is Poland, where arguably there was a lot of checks and balances. The diet was very empowered to constrain the rulers. So it's just outliers, or you have some explanations?
I don't have explanations for these, to be honest. Kind of
Right.
the Poland, that's a very recent, and the Russia thing kind of it's still positive. It's still positive. So kind of I was convinced that it could just be a measurement thing too.
All right. Okay. Thanks.
And I don't think that it's important to note that not a lot of the differences are truly significant over here. So I don't think Poland and Russia, for instance, would be significantly different in here. So
I see. Okay. Thanks.
May I add a question and possibly a suggestion?
Please.
Right now. So my question is, do you control for the initial state area in 10th century? So why is this may be important? Because for Russia, as Leonid quite pointed, it seems like an outlier. But I would argue that it's not if you control for the initial area, because the initial area was quite small and it grew pretty much at a stable rate throughout centuries, regardless of the abilities of the monarch.
But this uses the assessment of the assessment of state performance. So this is not the results using growth of the country, the kind of the territorial expansion, but it takes our measure of state performance. So it wouldn't explain here. But I take the kind that I have to look deeper into Russia versus Poland and think about what could this drive this potential difference. But what's crucial here is two things. What we want to take away from this is basically there's some variation, but there's not a lot in the sense that a lot of those countries, the effect is very much throughout those countries. For most, you see a sizable effect and significant one. However, there's interesting variation in that for England, truly for some countries, for England after 1600, when Parliament becomes strong, you no longer see an effect. But let's kind of I'll talk about detail later. Okay, so this is just correlational analysis, and this is a very straightforward kind of explanation that many things can happen if I show you assessments of ability of a ruler and the condition of a country. One being reverse causality, maybe because the country did well, it reflects on how writers and historians write about the monarch and kind of accrue ability to him. Similarly, could have omitted variables that basically during a particular time period, something else created able monarchs, allowed the ascension of able monarchs, and for a country to do well. So we're, in a sense, there's a lot of reason to believe that our OLS estimates do not identify a causal effect. And so what we're going to do is we're going to identify this using, as I talked about earlier, these two crucial features of our instrument. One being primogeniture, that rulers became appointed independent of their ability. So there's not like an election of a monarch, but rather you become the monarch because you're the son of the monarch. And there's quasi-random variation in the ability of those rulers because those dynasties have been intermarrying for centuries, and genetic closeness creates this potential for genetic disorders that render certain individual bad leaders.
Oh, I'm sorry, Sebastian.
Please.
are you certain that genetic closeness is unrelated to the country's economic conditions? So, for example, I am deciding whether or not to marry my son to my niece or to someone else. And that might depend on whether or not I want to strengthen an existing alliance, to which I'm already related, or maybe find some new alliances. And that in turn might depend on how well my country is doing, for example, economically.
Absolutely. We consider the concerns later in great detail. What I, on top of my head, I think that the most straightforward thing to say is that a lot of this inbreeding actually is not just a one generational thing. It's not just you marrying your daughter to say kind of someone that's to a cousin, but it's more like the fact that what's really driving this is generations of inbreeding. That sometimes even kind of you don't even know that you're marrying your daughter to someone that's already somewhat close to you, but because of centuries of inbreeding before you, there's a lot of connection that somehow out of nowhere, this measure of inbreeding appears, so to say. So what we do in the paper directly is that we basically, and I'll show you this to you later, is we just take the component that is not just a one generational thing. So Charles, I think I'll have this in a second here. Charles II was the son of offspring of, was the offspring of aunt and uncle and niece. But we take away this variation. We take away the part of the coefficient of inbreeding that comes from this, and just look at the residual, this hidden inbreeding in the deeper layers of the family tree, and just use this hidden part as our instrument. But I'll show it to you in a second. I hope this convinces you for now. So these two features of the setting enable us to basically use a measure of inbreeding, this coefficient of inbreeding, as an instrument for the ability of rulers. Now, and it's very straightforward that why to think, that's the link Alexia has been talking about, of why is there a link of a condition of a country from the coefficient of inbreeding or the other way around. We'll try to convince that this is not the case. And it's likely to believe that most of the effect of, and the effect, the sole effect of inbreeding goes via the ability of a ruler. What's crucial to us is that that basically the effects of inbreeding were unknown to monarchs and unknown at the time when Woods coded this up, because only very late, only in 1921, people learned how to measure inbreeding correctly, and that it has negative effects was still a topic hotly debated in biology up until the 1950s and later. So what do we mean when we talk about inbreeding, and what do we mean when we talk about inbred rulers? So the most famed example here is Carlos II of Spain, which you see down here beyond at the end of his family tree, which, as the heading already suggests, is not a common family tree, because it does not expand out. It does not expand outwards. Rather, it converges to him, and the disaster of Spain at the time converged in him too. So what you see is how the economists put it very nicely, so that I can use it in here. I don't have to make such a nice graph myself. What you see is different linkages, and how, as I said, we're kind of basically uncle and niece marry in between Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, created Charles II of Spain. But it's not only this. It's not only this one generation, but actually there's a whole backlog, a whole kind of deeper layer in the deeper layers of the pedigree, where a lot of this already dates back to Philip I of, so that over many linkages. One of the common forebears is Philip of Castile and Joanna of Castile, that already very on was dubbed the Mad. So it wasn't already kind of good material to begin with, so to say, and then kind of over various linkages, it all returns in Charles II of Spain. That's not uncommon, and but it is an extreme example. And
sorry, but they were certainly all aware of their family trees. They knew their family trees back many generations. And they knew that it was common knowledge that Joanna of Castile was contributed a lot to that kind of she contributed a lot to his genetics. That was common knowledge.
That it was absolutely, that there was some component, but quantifying it was not, and the fact that it's bad was also not. So people couldn't know kind of that it's in the, whereas they saw it, well, there's like, we're keeping it in the family in a sense, and kind of because we're not going to marry to some commoner. See, we're kind of, we're part of the noble elite of these countries. So I'm only going to marry yourself to another king. So that there was a kind of, they knew these family trees, definitely, not to the extent that we do nowadays. And more crucially, they can't calculate the measures that we do with it. They don't know, not in the 1920s, not in the 1910s, did they know how to calculate coefficient of inbreeding correctly. So they couldn't know, and they didn't know that it's bad in the first place. We know, and we see it now kind of in Charles II. As a picture, you can already see kind of his the chin of the Habsburgs. He was when Woods called him an imbecile. His tongue was too big to speak clearly. He couldn't walk until age 4. Kind of, he couldn't speak until age 8. So kind of he was very incapable as a ruler, consequently, and he left the country in decline and left no heir. Now, after Charles II, the Bourbons, the French Bourbons, took over, became the Spanish Bourbons, and Bourbons, and took over and became the kings of Spain, the new ones. Now, after a line of a few mediocre rulers, Charles III appeared, after whom the university is called, still up until the present in Madrid, who was of the Spanish Bourbon dynasty, as I told you, far less inbred than Carlos II was, rendered enlightened, efficient, just, sincere, and Spain, unsurprisingly, flourished under his reign and came to new heights. Now, we know the particular extent to which these individuals, excuse me, were inbred, because in 1921, Wright advanced and pioneered the measurement of inbreeding, of a coefficient of inbreeding, which basically measures the probability that the two gene copies in an individual are identical by descent and hail from the common ancestor, which in the case of Charles II was one of those common ancestors were Joanna and Philippe in the first case. Now, this measure ranged from 0 to 1, where 0.5 is self-fertilization. The most kind of thing you get in real life is the sibling parent offspring of 0.25. And more common one is first cousins, uncle, niece, 0.125. Now,
Sebastian, excuse
yes.
me, there's another question by Constantine in the chat. I don't know if you can access the chat, otherwise I can read it out for you.
No, his predecessors won the war for Spanish inheritance. So crucially, what we do is we're going to focus later on those monarchs that came to that came to power because of primogeniture. So not just the monarchs that basically that conquered or became the new monarchs, and I agree there's some potential of selection in there. But we're going to focus on those that were not that didn't claim their heritage in such a way. So that's what we're going to do in the paper. In biology, it's well known that kind of inbreeding is bad. It kind of decreases your fitness. There's something called inbreeding depression, where a lot of means there's large negative effects in that the risk of intellectual disability is increased by a large factor. IQ scores for first cousins, for the offspring of first cousin, are significantly lower. With rich evidence that it did so for the European monarchs too, and that the monarchs did not know, because the science only emerged later on. And even so, formally, the Catholic Church prohibited cousin marriage, the nobility was in practice largely exempt. So what we do, for the sake of this paper, is we basically collect measures of this coefficient of inbreeding for about 400 monarchs from a genealogical database, which is crowdsourced and which we cross-check and validate. And then showing something like this, such as the intermarriage, the coefficient of inbreeding, a histogram among different European monarchs. Here, for instance, you see Carlos II, you saw earlier, and you see that he is factually, even though his parents are only uncle and niece, he is, because of these deeper connections in the family tree, he is as inbred, or even more inbred, as the offspring of siblings, or say a parent-child would be. It's not the only such case. There's kind of case such as Adolphus Frederick of Sweden, Holstein, not Holstein, whose parents also were merely first cousins. But again, because of deeper inbreeding in the deeper family tree, he also has a higher coefficient of inbreeding because of this. Now, the crucial point is for us is that inbred monarchs are versely assessed monarchs by Woods and by our measures. Now, technically, we show you here is again the residual of the bin scatter of rulerability and the coefficient of inbreeding, our first stage, and you see that very straightforward that able monarchs are that inbred monarchs are incapable monarchs. So that's the first stage. It's very robust. It's sizable, kind of. It's not driven by individuals, such as only by say Woods or other such highly inbred individuals. It's also the case for those where we can truly identify that these are the monarchs that came to power due to documented primogeniture. So we can really put the name on it, say it's documented primogeniture. And with this first stage, we basically go back to our OLS results and perform an instrumentary variable analysis. Specifically, I'm showing you here the results of the second stage, where I confirm the results of the OLS, showing that in fact the causal effect, there's a causal effect of ruler ability on the performance of the states. Again, this holds for excluding some of those very inbred monarchs, and also by focusing on our second outcome, which is the area under control of a monarch. So, Bernardo, sorry to pinch you up on that. I'm out of time, am I?
Well, we still have about 10 minutes. Please go ahead.
Okay, perfect, excellent. Then I'm more than time.
Thanks.
So, what you see here, one of the things that you would have noticed is that the second stage coefficients are larger than our OLS coefficients, which we think kind of is evidence in that Woods, in his own bias, he judged those monarchs of which he knew that they are kind of more intertwined with the elites better than he would have done others. So that's why kind of he basically corrects this measurement error of his in that regard. Okay, so I hope I convinced you with this that basically using the coefficient of inbreeding, the degree of inbreeding in these monarchs as an instrument for rulerability allows us to uncover the causal effect of those monarchs, of their ability on the performance of their states during their reign. There's various threats to this identification. I think one that we talked about is I think that Alexei brought up was kind of the strategic marriage of outside or inside the kin network. So what if you basically marry someone when you marry when performance is low, say, and when as talked earlier, when because of you're gonna marry your son off to someone, then with the idea of kind of creating an alliance and profiting later from this. So one of these things that we do is one of the potential reasons you could think about is that, well, when you're under threat, you might want to create those alliances, and then basically you have a more inbred monarch, but you're also but you also have a strong alliance and you can profit in the future. However, because you were already under threat, it actually might be the case that you kind of because of the past bad say performance, also your current performance gets lower, and then this would be a problem for us. However, what we show is that past state performance does not predict the ability of a ruler. So it's not that because the country did well in the past, that it now gets kind of better or worse rulers. And crucially, we can include lag measures of state performance controlling for this and show that our IV results are not affected by it. Another thing, what if they knew about the negative effects and they knew the pedigrees to some extent? They couldn't calculate these measures, but they knew it. And they still incurred them just for endogenous reasons, just because they were related to future state performance. So, well, you marry someone off to someone related, you might get a worse ruler, but this marriage itself is worse the worse ruler. It's worse. So what we do in that regard is that we basically only use the hidden component of the inbreeding coefficient. And let me briefly give you a hint of what we do in here. Specifically, Carlos II was the offspring of uncle and niece. That implies already a kind of a pretty sizable coefficient of inbreeding for himself. However, his actual inbreeding coefficient is far higher. So what we do is we basically identify the naive F that we have for a relationship up until cousins, aunt, offspring, cousin, the coefficient for those, and define a hidden coefficient of inbreeding and use only this part of the inbreeding that is not related to a strategic decision or generation before, but if anything, multiple generations before and potentially not even planned in a meaningful way. Now, using only this, we can using only this, we confirm our baseline results in that basically, even with this reduced, even with just the hidden component of inbreeding, we still find that that similar sized effects, and in fact that capable, that inbred monarchs are bad monarchs, and that capable monarchs lead to better performance of their states. Various other things we do, all of them are in the paper. One of them getting better the time dimension, just comparing rulers that ruled at the same time to one another and doing basically pairwise comparison and running the analysis all at that level. But let me use the last few minutes to talk about something else. Let me talk about so now what did monarchs, countries, could they do anything? Like say in a sense, you get uncapable, you get inbred monarchs, and those monarchs tend to be bad for your countries. So what happened? So from modern literature, we have an idea that basically the legal constraints to their power matters. So what we do is we basically combine data on the legal constraints to executive power. Where the first data we use is from Asamoah, Johnson, and Robbins in their 2005 paper, where we have this measure at the half century. And so basically we start coding rulers as constrained when they are constrained at the beginning of their reign. Constrained meaning when their constraints on executive is above some threshold, to which is that basically the executive has more effective authority than any accountability group, but is subject to substantial constraints from those accountability groups. So in the for a restricted data, this is basically England from 1600 onward and the Netherlands from 1550 to 1750. Now we know that England, the monarch of England, was not constrained throughout the 17th century. So what we do is we refine this coding at the century level and bring it to a year-by-year level, where we basically go through the same primary sources as Asamoah, Johnson, and Robinson, and look at the same sources and identify the particular year of a change. So say for the 17th century, HAR code England as having substantial limitations. However, the turbulent centuries, there's many things that are happening. The kind of parliament is strong in the beginning, but then also the monarch is strong at different points in time. And we can get at this finer variation by basically coding it up ourselves. What you see here is the constraints of executive from HAR for all of the 17th century. And what you see here in green is our year-by-year coding of particular changes in here, where you can, for instance, see the drop of the executive power rises when the parliament was dissolved in 1629. And again, when the parliament is strong, the constraints on the executive are stronger. We do this for all those countries and all those years, and then use this as our measure as well. And lastly, we add another measure of parliament of constraints on the executive by measuring the activity of parliaments. Arguably of different nature, but also where we just create a dummy again, saying the ruler is constrained when parliament meets more often than in 95% of those cases. So with us, we basically interact our baseline regression and find that the effect for rulerability is still there, but it is muted in times and locations and point when the ruler is constrained by a strong parliament or other strong groups, by strong peer groups that basically stake of any effect that he could have. So we find this throughout for all these measures of a constrained ruler, and we find in the we barely non-significant. We also find it for the instrument variable, and this is also strong for different cutoffs. It's not driven just by the cutoff or by different sources. So in sense, when the monarchs were actually faced with a strong parliament, their ability didn't matter any longer. So the parliament basically shielded European monarchies from the effect of their monarchs when they were strong. So in conclusion, this paper we have built a kind of novel data set on the reign-specific rulerability, state performance, institutions, degree of inbreeding, and with this reign-specific data set, have identified a causal link from rulerability, from the ability of monarchs, to the performance of their states during the reign of those monarchs. But what's crucial for identification is this fixed rules of ascension to power and exogenous variation in ability due to inbreeding common among European nobilities. Crucially, the effect is dampened by constraints on ruler power that emerge particularly strongly in the west, in the northwest of Europe, later in time. In a sense, this can argue that the strengthened parliaments help northwestern Europe to escape the negative effects of their ever more inbred rulers in those time periods. So we're currently looking at coding the actions of the monarchs in particular and their effect on particular components of state performance. So not just the country as a whole is doing well, but what about particular components such as urban growth and also things at once. For what we find now from this preliminarily just for England is that the policies that seem to matter for monarchs is administration and reforms to administrative systems seem to matter a lot in monarchs advancing the fate of their countries. So with this, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions and hope I can answer most of those.
Thanks very much, Sebastian. And the floor is open for questions and comments, please.
I have a couple of quick questions. So the first one is on the relationship between the hidden coefficient of inbreeding and the naive one. Like, what's the correlation between these two?
That's good. I don't know on top of my head, but the basic one just for the cases where we know that the cousin, that the parents were cousins, or aunt and niece, or aunt and uncle and niece, we take away of this. And we've also done it for deeper levels, for second degrees, cousins and things. I think they're still highly correlated, definitely. But what's crucial is that it's no longer the inbreeding due to the last generation.
Okay, and the second question, and this related to one of the bullet points that you put in the last slide, that you mentioned that in Western Europe, like rulers become ever more inbred. And do you have like a sort of pattern how the inbreeding of rulers evolve over time, like from the beginning of your dataset until the end?
So I should have this graph, and I've been asked before. So we have this. What we have in the papers, we've looked at it in terms of statistics. We know that it increases over time, but it particularly strongly increases in northwestern Europe. But I can't tell you the numbers in the paper, and the graph is on the to-do list to show you a nice graph of how it emerges over time and how it changes. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. I'm sorry, I have one last question, actually related to something that Timur mentioned. How to put it? Like, do you have any argument on which the size of the state matters? Okay, like if no, the other way around. So if the ability of the ruler matters more in a big state or in a smaller state, do you have any comments on this?
No, I don't. So the idea would be the ruler has to project his power, so to say, and if the country gets large, it might be tougher to project such power. I
mean, I can think in both ways. Either that in a larger state that you need to rely more on other people to administrate, and maybe in that case ability matter less. But also you can think, okay, to put the right people, then ability matters more. So at least in my mind, it's not clear in which way it can work. But I was wondering if you have any ideas on this or not really.
As you said, I think I can imagine to in small states it's probably easier to rule, but then again, in a sense, what makes a large country run could also just be the appointment of different local authorities that might also depend on your ability. So but you might expect the effect potentially to be weaker in larger countries where you have this and where the potential bearing of an individual gets weakened over appointments potentially. But then, yeah, it's probably an empirical question. I think I could look at this.
Okay, that's it on my side. And well, Konstantin has one question, please.
Yeah. I have a question. So do you take into account the neighbors? Because if we take the example of Maria Theresa that you showed, she had a strong neighbor in form of Friedrich II, who took over Silesia. But at the same time, at the end of her reign, she had weak neighbors in form of Poland, and therefore this allowed her to conquer large territories in the east.
That is great. The the fact that not just that so what we have in the papers, we look at ruler pairs. So say you compare Maria Theresa with whoever ruled in Prussia at the same point in time and to all these other individuals. I haven't taken into account the fact that they were neighbors. So this would be basically, so what I do here is I find for each ruler those that ruled contemporaneously, and then I calculate pairwise differences in their performance, in their ability, and in their coefficients of relationship. Now with this, and then basically I run regressions of the same type than before and confirm that it's basically do this because we don't really like the century fixed effects, because century are some odd measure of time. So we just try to get better with the getting the contemporaneous leaders and to know what it means to be a good leader at a different point in time. But but this does not get at the nation of which are the neighbors. So we should run a reduced version of this just for the neighbors. I think this would address your concern, kind of, and to see whether it might be stronger in this. That's an interesting concern, interesting idea. Concern. Great, thank you.
All right, please, anyone else for the questions? Perhaps any comments?
Yeah, I have a clarification question. How do you deal with unifications or splitting the countries? How do you code them? The example that came to my mind was Germany, which was basically non-unified until the end of the 19th century. It was a collection of independent small states. Italy is the same. It comes to my mind because the time span is so huge in your research. It could many states just change their affiliations at the time.
Absolutely. So, and the big thing is we don't like for those states that have a lot of small states. Because Italy and Germany, we don't have a lot. So for Germany, we have Prussia and Austria, and that's it. And only because they later become large states. So we don't have any of the small, say Hesse-Kassel, Hesse-Darmstadt. We don't have any of those, or the kind of the Italian states. We don't have those. And we have some cases where countries unify, such as say Aragon takes over Castile, and so we code it as one from that point in time. Hungary joins Austria in I think it's 1550 de facto, and similar we have splits. Sweden splitting from Denmark. So whenever they split, kind of we code them as new entities. And if they combine, we basically code them as part of the older one. And then you'll see that that Spain increases in size tremendously when Castile joins it.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. Please, for the questions, for the comments. Well, Sebastian, if I may, I have a couple. First, about correlation of errors. You said that you're controlling for dynasty, but you view inbreeding as a bad thing, quite obviously. But on the other hand, if parents are capable, if they have some accomplishments, then in fact it might bode well for siblings, so it might be counteracting effect. In other words, is there any chance you can control for the success of parents, grandparents, ancestors? I think that would be a natural thing to do. And that might be well beyond the dynasty because people marry across dynasties. So
what we do in the paper is that we look at we can control for past state performance. So in fact, we can basically control for past state performance, either it has a bearing on current state performance, but it does not but past coefficients of inbreeding do not. So in a sense,
yeah, well, there might be some path dependency in how a state performs, irrespective of the quality of the leader. You know, if you inherited a well-functioning state, even if you're stupid.
Exactly, and that's what we're controlling for here.
Right, but what I'm saying is that, well, since you're looking at genetics, genetical effects related to ancestry could not only be bad because of inbreeding, but also could carry on some positive traits of parents. On the one hand, there is a saying that the nature rests on genius children, right? But on the other hand, all else equal, if you have a strong father, then chances are you're going to be smart as well.
There is some intergenerational persistence, absolutely.
Yes,
and
right,
but what's crucial is that that inbreeding is there would be a concern for the monotonicity assumption in RIB, basically. Well, what if kind of inbreeding creates smart individuals out of accident? So the good thing is that it doesn't happen in a sense. Inbreeding is very straightforwardly, like Woods, the guy who coded our data, believed that inbreeding is good and kind of these noble traits are being passed on to future generations. And some of the monarchs probably did too. Now we know it's very kind of secure knowledge nowadays that it does not. So there's some consistent kind of some effect of persistence of positive traits, but inbreeding per se is bad, because inbreeding basically lowers your gene heterogeneity. So kind of
no. If I may, there are no doubts about inbreeding being bad, but there is one thing you might want to control for, and controlling for the quality of your ancestors, irrespective of inbreeding, could bring some additional insight into your analysis.
For past ability, for lack of ability.
Right, yes, right. If you're near to very smart parents, very successful parents, that all else equal should probably have some impact. And my second suggestion, I guess, history has assigned to some rulers glorifying gratulatory titles like Friedrich the Great or so-and-so the terrible or the wise or whatnot. So why not take a dummy for such a title and see if this dummy would do the job similar to what you do? Because this is kind of, endogenous assessment of the performance. It might be a fun thing to do.
And not always influenced by themselves. Kind of like Charles II was known as the bewitched, so that he didn't kind of choose it.
So it's successful PR, public relations. Okay, Maria has a question, please.
Yeah, thanks very much for quite an interesting presentation. Since I'm not a historian, I probably have a stupid question, but still, so inbreeding is like kind of marriage within the family. So is it possible that inbreeding somehow correlates with keeping assets within the family in a way? So it's probably you make your siblings to marry together to keep your assets more stronger. Because if you give your daughter outside the family, you have to do some amount of assets outside, and that's make you weaker. So is there maybe some strategic things behind that, or inbreeding might affect this kind of issues?
For a very short time period, yes, but usually kind of kings learn very quickly that it's not a good idea to farmers and pastors and farmers in nearby Baden-Württemberg, they learn it that actually it's not good to kind of pass on to all of your kids. That's why they come with primogeniture. Basically, someone is taking all the assets, and the others one get married off or sent to the church or to other positions. I think the Protestant countries for some time period experimented with this, but then they very quickly stopped again. So for most of our time period, basically, it's not that these assets get split; they get passed on, and they stay in the family nevertheless. It's an interesting question.
I have another question. So you, as far as I understood, you measure the state performance by some measure of woods, which I didn't really understood, and by the area of the country. Would it be possible to use other measures such as, for example, the population size, or even some measure of economic performance, like some estimate of GDP? I know that at least for the currently existing countries, you have estimates of GDP going pretty far into the past.
So very much like the Jones and Olcott paper, we actually use GDP. Our problem here is that the best estimates for GDP we have in before the 20th century are at the century level or the half century level. So we need at the reign level. So we need to know, like, at some point in time a monarch starts, and then that's why we use our other second best measure of state borders, because state borders we observe at some shorter time intervals. But we just don't observe, say, urban population or total population or any measures of economic activity at such a fine temporal detail. That's the main reason for using that. But yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So the best we have is the guesstimates of historians on particular, say, in a century or so.
Thanks so much. Let me see if there are any other comments or questions. Oral or in the chat column? I don't see any. I don't hear any, which leads me to thanking Sebastian very much for a thought-provoking presentation. Thanks for joining the seminar, and we'll reconvene next week, right, Bernardo?
Yes, well, thanks, Sebastian, for this interesting paper. And well, so next week we have Leopoldo Ferguson from the Universidad de los Andes, and he's going to present his paper on which is named the weak states trap, which talks about like weak states and clientelism. So hopefully you can all join us next week, same time, same place. So well, have a good rest of the week, everyone. And for those in Russia, enjoy your pancakes this week.
Thanks
Thank you so
very
much for having me. Thank you so much. Thanks for
Thanks
taking
to
comments.
everyone. See you soon.
Take care,
Bye-bye.